How about cyclist, guitarist, storage veteran, and great human? Does that sound like a really good combination? I sure think it does. I was very lucky to recently have a conversation with somebody who you are about to enjoy the experience of. I gotta first of all give a shout out to Georgiana Kamsa. This is Chris Cummings. Chris Cummings works at FalconStor. He's a strategy consultant that's focused in the whole data and storage industry, and he's doing great stuff with the team. So you're going to find out what they're doing, how he's doing really good things with life moves and giving back to the community. This is Chris Cummings on the DiscoPosse podcast, and it starts now. How often do you get a chance to meet somebody from the industry that you met through their PR firm on Instagram? Is that cool or what? This is the world that we live in today, and I'm thankful that we live in this world for that very reason. This is a great conversation with Chris Cummings. We're going to dive into the technology of storage. So if you're a storage nerd, you're in for a treat. Oh yeah, hang tight, hang tight. But most of all, if you like this and these kind of conversations, make sure you do me a favor and you do that thing. Where's the button? Wherever the button is. Hit that button. So if you want to hit subscribe, make sure you can keep in touch with what's happening on the channel, get notified when new shows come up. We've got a lot of great stuff coming down the pike, or is it pipe? Whatever it is. Let's get right to it. This is Chris Cummings from FalconStor, and we're going to talk about what he's doing there, what he does around giving back to the community. He's a cyclist. That alone is a reason to listen. Hope you enjoy the show.
I'm Chris Cummings. I'm an advisor to FalconStor Software, and welcome to the DiscoPosse podcast.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for joining today. First of all, because through a friend in the industry, we got connected, and I'm always excited when you see people and then immediately you research them. And you take a look on their LinkedIn and you see all these people you know together, and you start to think to yourself, why in goodness name have we already talked before? And we probably have at some point through different things and events and such. But thank you very much for coming. And for folks that are brand new to you, maybe if you'd want to take a minute, introduce yourself, and let folks know where they can find you online, and we're going to jump into the conversation.
Sure. So again, my name is Chris Cummings, and I've been in and around the storage industry now for about 20 years, and in all forms, whether that's been on the primary side, whether that's on the secondary storage side, whether that's on the cloud side. And today I'm speaking on behalf of FalconStor Software, which is a company that's been around for quite some time, but is finding a new home as enterprises around the world are adopting cloud faster than I think anyone thought they would, before the start of the pandemic. So it's been a terrible situation for the world, but in many ways it's been a reasonably good situation for the company.
Yeah, and this is why I think it was such an interesting topic to cover. For folks that are in tech, they may have known FalconStor, and there's really is like a long sort of storied history, lots of challenges in the organization. And I mean, as with many things, I mean, the storage is such an interesting market in that there's regular sort of birth of startups that come out, and then there's a sort of the mass reconsolidation to some of the major players, and then we get these sort of waves of new phases in storage innovation. And then, I'd say I saw a lot of people that suddenly left major companies after their startups were acquired. So we're probably about a year away from another wave coming out. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to actually let's explore FalconStor kind of from the very beginning. That's how long has the company been around?
Yeah, so the company's been doing this work for about 20 years, really in the same area, which has been backup and long-term archive. And, I got to know the company because when I started in at NetApp about 20 years ago, one of my teams managed the FalconStor relationship. And so
Oh, wow.
that's how I got to know the company in the Wayback Machine. And as you said, really has gone through a bunch of twists and turns. And not unlike many, kind of went from being an appliance to being software only, and
Right.
went from being a channel company to a direct company, and now we're firmly back into being a channel focused company. So these twists and turns that you see so commonly, this company's been through all of them, and probably a couple of times. But the good news has been that this last turn towards channel software and being a cloud enabler has been, that is really sticking and finding a home for many enterprises now.
It brings up the interesting thing that, in fact, the vision and the original team vision and a lot of the original engineering, in fact, was probably ahead of its time. And it takes a while for the industry to actually catch up. And the consumer market, I say the customer market, not consumer. So like the enterprise consumer market, we as an enterprise, industry are horrifyingly slow at adopting innovative technologies and new technologies. And we also have the problem that we look on the like approved PO, history, and
Mhm.
we tend to always go, well, I like your technology. It looks really interesting. My team loves it. How long have you guys been around? And it's like, oh, we're a 5-year-old company and we came out of stealth 2 years ago. And they're like, okay, we'll tell you what, get to customer 100 and then give us a call. And
Right.
so then you go through that phase. And then from there, somebody says, oh, okay, well, I think we're kind of ready for it. And then meanwhile, the major player vendors then say, hey, we do that thing too over here, when they usually don't, but they just, at least they've got the ability to promise and ride it out financially when they fail.
That's right. And we see both sides of the spectrum, right? Which is, when you talk to any IT organization, naturally there's a group of folks that are looking for, show me the shiny new object, right? And I actually came from one of the customers that or companies I was working with most recently was in the software defined scale out block space. And so that was a new technology built for early adopters, no question. Um, and then this company is more of we've seen all that, we've tried those things, we had some successes, we had some failures. How about showing me something that actually works? And so it's nice to be on this side of the equation at this point, where we have over an exabyte of data under management and we have 1,000 active customers. But for many of these customers, they are still like perhaps some of the listeners, they're in that transition period from an on-prem focus to a cloud focus, and they're trying to get the right mix, because we know that for most enterprises, it's going to be a balance of the two working together.
Right. Yeah, the thing about this race to the cloud is it's a turtle-like pace at which it goes. And in fact, it's not like the entire race ends up there. We've got to find what's the right data, what's the right application profile to leave behind, to leave out there in the cloud, what can be
Right.
containerized. And then this is where the when it all comes down to it, it's where the data lives and how we access the data. That is, in fact, going to be the real decision maker, not the CIO reading in Network World that the cloud is the future. I date myself. I'm sure Network World is not even a magazine anymore, but I used to remember those days of coming in and they'd say, Eric, we need to find out why we're not in the cloud. Like, what happened? What'd you read on the weekend?
Right. Right. Or I remember talking to Matt Eastwood from IDC a couple years ago, and at that point in time, he was talking about, I think the number was 60% of enterprises repatriating from the cloud.
Yeah.
And when I challenged him on that, he said, no, actually the number is more like 80% of enterprises are repatriating 50% of their applications. And so that's not necessarily doomsday for the cloud. Those were applications that were born in the cloud. They weren't meant to live there forever. But I think, now we're at the next round of this, which is, how much is going to be on-prem and how much is going to be in the cloud, and what's the right mix, and finding that right mix is going to be different when you're talking about, a primary application, or, a tertiary application, or you're talking about primary storage or secondary data.
Right. Yeah, well, and this is where it becomes the interesting thing, and I think we've realized that there's a very key difference in separating, where and how data needs to be accessed.
Mhm.
And the idea of, at one point we talked about HSM, the hierarchical storage management, and there were some vendors that were getting into that game of like auto tiering and moving stuff in and out based on, utilization profile. Most of it was really like you right click and say, mark this as slow, and move it down to slow disk.
Mhm.
But then again, too early for enterprises to really understand how their applications behaved, and it was expensive to do at any kind of scale. So
Yeah.
then we went back to, okay, I'm going to, as a storage architect, design multiple tiers and such. But then I was choosing hardware platforms to back it. And then I was now having to make different business and architectural decisions together. And now we have software that becomes the perfect abstraction.
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, I was part of the team, for instance, at NetApp when we bought Bicast, which is the storage grid object storage product.
Right.
And I also was part of the leadership team that built CleverSafe, and we sold that to IBM, and that's now IBM Cloud Object Storage. So this notion of transparently migrating data from the most hot, the most expensive to the coldest, the cheapest, it's a great idea until you, the administrator, have to be responsible for it.
That's right.
And then it's the idea that costs you a bunch of sleep, and in the worst of times, potentially your job, because that data is so critical. Now we've seen the folks from AWS are really trying to make that a lot simpler in terms of migrating from various forms of S3 down to Deep Glacier.
Right.
But having policies and automation that can do that for your data that's on premise and in the cloud, that's clearly where this is going. And that's actually something that FalconStor does. And, it's kind of who knew, right? When I got here, who knew? I had no idea.
That is, and this is the one thing that it pains me so much, because I know, like, I purposefully go out of my way to follow companies. And even then, I still miss fantastic stories
Yeah.
and stuff that's going on. And we get the unfortunate problem too of, oh yeah, I remember looking at FalconStor back in like 2012, and and that's it. It now that influences future interactions because we're humans and we have this like referential point. And so when you go through changes and new engineering and new platforms, new products, you got to go out and, hit not just your customer base, but also the industry. And it's an expensive process because you're going up against the NetApps and the major players of the world who have multi-million-dollar budgets that they can just throw at advertising and such. So when you're going through McCarran Airport on the way to whatever show of choice, back when we used to go to airports and shows,
Yeah.
You just see it plastered with some vendor, and it's meanwhile you've got this fantastic technology and you're like, no, remember, look at this. Like, we've been here for a long time. We're doing this well. We've got 1,000 customers.
Yeah.
It's hard to kind of remind people that you're much more than what they may remember you for.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also a different dimension of success, right? The success for Dell or, NetApp or, an IBM is so much built around risk management around the revenue line. And that's really the focus. And but for a company like ours, yes, we have to be thinking about the financials. We always do. But for us, it's really about adding more value to that install base. And that's really what the company's been at work on for the last year, which is that install base that said, I got to get operations under control. I'm going to make sure that I've got my on-premise footprint right sized to the nth degree, but they're under pressure to get to the cloud too, just like everybody else. And being able to do that with security and also with economics, because as you know, you've probably heard everyone talks about the cloud and says, yeah, we got to get to the cloud. The great news about the cloud is it's cheap to fail.
Yeah, that's right.
It's really expensive to succeed. So we can't make this, a fool's errand by making it more expensive and more risky.
Yeah, and this is also the tough thing, and it's funny, before we get started, I tell people, I'm like, hey, I'm not going to talk about competitors and whatever, and I've already started name dropped. I chose NetApp just as an example to call off because I'm actually I had a lot of great friends there, and
Yeah.
I know you're differentiated from them in so many different ways. But the other thing is that when we look at like the IBMs, the Dells, these folks that's their target market is different.
Right.
And unfortunately, you also end up getting compared against that. But meanwhile,
Right.
like off the podium, in the Olympics, the podium is all that matters. And fourth place is the worst feeling ever, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're in the storage market, the fourth place is a pretty fantastic place to live because you're not fighting the top three. And you actually have an incredibly large mid-market base and a small enterprise and mid-sized enterprise and even large enterprise that it's not like before in like the 2000s, even when you'd say, or 90s, I'm like, I'm going to use this vendor for storage, which means if I want to, I've got another vendor that's coming in and they say they've got this great storage. So we need to get rid of the first vendor. And they're like, no. I go in a rack and I see 9 logos in the rack now, and everybody's okay with it. Finally.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And so the key being, can you enable what they already have? When I'm working with companies, we always talk about the basics: who, where, when, where, why, how. And then you get to B2B tech and you add the additional W, with.
Yeah.
Who can you do it with? Because these companies that you're familiar with, that you walk into and talk to, that I do, they have everything. They have something from everybody. And you can go in there and make a technical argument. Well, this should have been retired because we decided to go over here. But there were people there, and there probably still are people there, that made those choices for very good reasons. And so they don't want to let those things go. And this is so true in the backup and archive land that FalconStor lives in, where someone chose Net Backup and chose Veeam and chose Commvault and chose for very good reasons.
Yeah.
Do you really want to go through the pain of getting rid of that and redoing all of that sort of stuff? You can, if you have the time and you have the budget. But right now, people are hard pressed for time, and they're even harder pressed for budget.
Yeah.
So how do you fit in and add value?
The thing that it comes out very clearly is you're understanding the impact of partnership and alliance, and that we go together, and that competitors aren't really competitors. They're, co-opetition. We will end up in the data center with them. We will end up in the cloud with them. And even when you talked about like the partner and alliance ecosystem, it's a big move, to make that shift in, because you're now going on a list with other, competitive vendors. And so you've got to differentiate to that partner. But the advantage is that that partner is the famed trusted advisor phrase, right? But they've got a relationship. Yeah. They build one, you build one with them, they build one with the customer, they bring you in together, and it becomes that with. Instead of sell to, it's sell with, and it's such a fantastic move to make that transition.
Yeah, and it's even more true when you think about, the channel providers that are if there is such a thing as a trusted advisor, I think they may be even more trusted than the big vendors, because, they're going to get paid one way or another, right? Let's just face the facts. Whereas
that's right.
It's a war between the big technology providers. And So that's where I think you're exactly right. We can, if companies can walk in and be part of the equation and let people continue to use what they've already have on the floor, and their choices that they've made for the cloud, it just makes it that much easier to be trusted. Um, you know, we talk a lot about backup and archive as being really old. Well, yes, it's old data, but it's also an old style approach. And so there are a number of folks who will, say, "Hey, let's sweep that all clean and start all over again." But that's a pretty hard proposition. And I was talking to a friend of mine who runs a very large IBM focused channel provider, and he said, "We tried that. It's just a tough sale. Not because there's not value, but just because people got other things to do. They got to get their container story straight. They got to do all of that work." And they've also got to be working on security, because 2020 has been the year of breaches, right? So
Yes.
their,
Yeah.
their focus is elsewhere. So how do you make this simple becomes a big part of the equation.
And, this thing of it sounds easy, in practice, or, as you walk through, like, all you got to do is do this, move your archives away. We'll transition to this new method, and, we'll ingest your previous, like, no, no, like they can barely get through if they go 1 week off of their archive, and backup and offsite process, let alone to think about ingesting it. And look, backup protection and data archiving is a compliance thing.
Yeah,
It is a risk reduction thing, right? It is a regulated requirement for many companies.
right.
They're not very likely to suddenly say, "Yeah, we're gonna take 5 years of archive and we're gonna ingest it, metadata into your platform, and pretty cool if we're gonna suddenly trust a 4-year-old backup that was done through another system." So it is
Right.
very much a roll in beside,
Hmm.
transition the workflows. That's where the comfort comes. If you think that, the unfortunate arrogance when people come in there, where I'm just gonna unseat the competitor. Like, no, you're gonna sit beside the competitor for 4 years.
Right.
That's what you're gonna do.
For FalconStor, if you go back to when I first met the company, the competitor was tape.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
I
Still
remember
is in a lot of places, right?
one of my teams, was working with FalconStor as a partner, and that team was out promoting, eliminate tape now. Well, guess what? Tape won. It's still
Yeah.
here, and so it's more about how do you use tape and where do you use tape and for what. And I think that becomes the equation for, particularly for the larger companies, as opposed to those that they started without tape, so therefore they never needed
Right.
this capability. That's just a different market than what FalconStor serves, versus those that are using the tape process aggressively, but they know that they need to do more than that, and they too are under pressure to get to the cloud. And the question is, tape is relatively cheap. Can they make it work with the cloud?
Yeah, it is such an interesting thing when I saw, like, you look at the archival options that are out in the cloud, and of course the reality is a lot of the infrastructure there is if purely on demand ephemeral infrastructure. So of course, the first thing you think is, what happens to my data when I go to, how do I get it to offline
Right.
storage somehow? Because we don't even often trust secondary online storage as a true. So we have to have, like, first tier is like business continuity to secondary site.
Right.
Second tier is, and let's go to somewhere that's offline and completely offline, so I can make sure it's archived. It's in a steel box somewhere, and
Yeah.
it's with Iron Mountain or something like that, right? I mean, and look, the cloud. I don't want to be the guy that uses the news as a marker, but as we're recording here, we just saw that the OVH
Mhm.
company cloud literally lost an entire data center. So this, and it's like anybody could have gone through that. I'm not picking on OVH. I'm calling out that OVH suffered what no one could have planned for. And they do, right? They say like they've got more data centers.
Mhm.
But in the end, if that was your primary data and there was no secondary copy, or worse, your secondary copy is in somewhere else in the same data center, which it often is.
Yeah.
Now what, right?
Yeah. Well, and I've been out talking to, for instance, all the analysts and saying, guys, I need to know where cloud fits in the 3-2-1 equation, right? The notion of 3-2-1 backup has been around for quite some time, right? 3 copies, 2 media, and 1 offsite. And for the large companies, that's actually not good enough anymore. And then the other thing goes, so what is offsite or offline? Is it just tape that's in a mountain, or is it, a copy that is secure in the cloud? And none of them have updated this, but I think this is something where companies that I'm talking to are looking for guidance on that front. And it's, I think there is an opportunity to really declare that, unfortunately for, say, OVH, um, one of the things that we have been able to do is say, listen, you may want to just replicate the data to a secondary site or replicate the data to a cloud, but you can also replicate the entire system, right? The software and the data, replicate that to a secondary data center, or you can use, an Equinix, or you can use, Amazon as the location for your secondary data center and close your secondary data center. So you hate to say that it always comes down to choice, but it really does when it comes to what's your risk profile as it relates to this data.
It's funny. In software, I'm surprised by how many times I remind people of what is the basis of financial profiling, which is KYC, know your customer. Know your customer is all aimed at understanding risk profile.
Right. That's
and
right.
then you invest against the KYC as your matrix of comfort and risk.
Yeah.
And when we get into data and ownership, like, of course, there's lots of options, like you said, but what are the right ones that fit the risk profile, the cost profile, and finding that equilibrium? And this is why, I love this idea of a common data plane,
right,
that now gives you the ability to make that underlying choice. And you've got a common way to access and manage it.
Right.
And I think that's where we're going to see the fun part, is the unification on different platforms, on different providers. And this is why I love the sweet spot where you and the team are sitting. And like I said, you got the customer account that shows you're doing something right.
Yep.
Even though FalconStor may be a quiet player relative to some other folks that people may know the names of as well.
Yeah.
You've got a really good business.
That's exactly right. And, it's funny because this year of 2020, the company had not a ton, but had definitely, a count of customers who called up and said, I have this stack of tapes over here. I need help because I can't bring my people on site to deal with this stuff anymore. And this wasn't really their operational, kind of weekly full type process. This was the stuff that was stuck in the corner. Over. So we had, one customer calls up and says, I have 20 petabytes of tape I need to ingest, and I need you to help me get that to the cloud. And that was not happening in 2019.
No, that's right.
That's the type of thing that I think it's going to cause. This is going to cause everyone to take a look back. And similarly, I was on the phone with, a larger customer the other day, and they're on a corporate mandate to shrink the number of data centers they have.
Yeah.
So when you say, hey, you're replicating to one of your other data centers, but you could actually replicate that to a colo and then be out of the data center business for that data center, that was music to their ears. But everyone's going through the right sizing let's hope to get to the post-COVID right sizing.
Yeah. Well, and I remember, and like you said, this idea of the repatriation that happened, and I called it the boomerang effect. We had a lot of folks that like, let's move an app to the cloud, and they're like, whoa, that was a terrible idea. You know, we weren't ready for it, so they bring it back. But as you said in that discussion with Matt Eastwood, it's like that's a misnomer. If you actually look at what's coming back, it was entirely appropriate that it came back because it shouldn't have been there in the bloody first place, you know. But now that we've looked through, and what was the other thing? My friend Randy Bias, he says the cloud is cheaper as long as you're willing to pay more.
Right.
And
That's right.
but what's different about it is the way in which you manage that expense.
Mhm.
And it's like as a business, purely, it's operational versus capital. So it is treated differently. We've got more and more companies that are all moving to subscription styles, focusing on ARR versus, large capital contracts.
Right.
So what you're having is the business world is catching up to the ability to consume cloud
Mhm.
because they're trying to convert their business to be cloud-like.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
they're kind of ready. And now, as you said, but they say, oh God, like I got a rack full of tapes and disk and, mid-tier storage that's holding my old archives. I need to make sure this is somewhere else and distributed safely. And like I said, last year and it taught us some really hard lessons about how we need to operate.
Yeah, and you can see the cloud vendors, responding, right? I mean, Amazon Amazon and Azure have both come out and, done, in the case of Amazon, have come out with new services to lower the cost profile. Azure did the same thing with archives, and then I was just on talking to them. Our friends at Wasabi that are the upstart that are saying, guess what? No egress fees,
Yeah.
and they're thriving. So the good news is now we're beginning to get choice in the cloud. We were so used to having all those choices that you and I know, and everyone out there knows in the data center. I could choose from Dell, NetApp, Hitachi, IBM, HPE, and I could play them all off one another. That was not the case in the cloud,
Right.
but it's getting there to that point.
Yeah, and at one point there was, I can't remember what year it was. We've probably had it year after year. There's this idea, they called it the race to zero, right? As we saw storage prices, especially, were precipitously falling
Right.
in the cloud providers. And I sat there watching, going, well, this isn't really a race to zero. It's a race to zero competitive differentiation, is what it is. At some point,
Yeah.
they're all going to get to a spot where they're going to say, I'm not saying it's collusion. I don't know a friendlier word for it, but where they all agree, okay, look, if we know we're at zero margin right now, let's
Right.
just stay there and focus on other differentiating services. And so I think we kind of got there and it leveled. And then you saw the service approach, and let's bring machine learning and other ways to interact with it. But egress, network fees,
Right.
data to store is only one tiny part of the function. It's how do you move that data around? What happens when you do stuff against that data? Oh,
Exactly.
now you've got a different sort of cost model to challenge with.
Yeah, and even for things that I know that some of the cloud guys are contemplating, like what's the fee profile for CPU usage when I'm going to be using compression and dedupe algorithms to shrink the cost of data? Well, they're not going to give up what the customer is spending, for the CPUs to chunk that all up and dedupe it.
That's right. It's the one thing, though, at least through all of it, is even in a very competitive marketplace where everybody's got to survive, right? And got to build and got to grow. And we're seeing this stuff. You really, really are seeing people rethink how we can provide IT, storage, network, and like all these services. Like, we are really seeing a good way that there's lots of competitive alternatives on the provider side. And then that frees you and your team and other folks in the industry have to say, "Look, let's just focus on doing that front end customer experience because we can take care of these beautiful API,
Mhm.
declarative back ends, and I can do what I need to do to put it there. But let's just unify the front so that my customer knows I'm the place that they can talk to, and then I'm the sort of provider, and then they can choose whatever commoditized underlay that they want.
Right. That's right. And that's the good news, is that's what's changed. And it has to, when you think about the amount of data that the enterprise is responsible for keeping around, and for timeframes that no one even thought about when we started this game. One of my teams, again, in 2004, we were talking to the financial companies, and for all the trading data, and then your account records and my account records, 7 years was the retention time frame that was mandated by the SEC.
Right.
Now you think about a 7-year archive, and you think you're at least multiplying that by a factor of 10. And what you don't see is, companies really ever getting rid of data actively. It's not something that they really
right.
do, because, frankly, it's going to be a bad day for that person who gets rid of the stuff that they shouldn't have. And it's going to be the next guy's problem to deal with. Well, how do I shrink the cost envelope, against that data that's the hangover, because secondary data is growing just so quickly.
Yeah, there's things that I've learned in time, is that, we keep things a lot longer than we should, including concert shirts and data. And the difference is that you won't get fired for getting rid of your Kiss t-shirt. You will, however, be at risk if you lose data. And it's funny when we talk about the 7-year thing, which I worked in financial services for a long time, and I chased down for a long time to actually find out where's the 7 written down somewhere. And it's actually never there, but it's like a reasonable time. And like we kind of landed on 7. What was a good number.
Yeah.
But what we did learn was that, through this, retention, first, it was like, keep it for regulatory purposes, for safety, for risk.
Right.
But now the difference is, I want to keep that data to use it.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's the thing that's incumbent upon everybody, including FalconStor, is, there's this notion of having it for the rainy day, and then there's the notion of having it for the day that you can actually make it of material use to you.
Right.
And you see this in certain industries. I mean, for instance, large, airline manufacturer that we work with. Well, they got to keep that stuff around, but they actually learn stuff from that data by having all that. The same is true when you think about EDA and you think about chip designs.
Right.
Those people never get rid of that. And then the new chip design is called genomics, and no one ever dumps genomic data. And that was true before COVID, and it's even more true now.
Yeah, I love that we've been able to finally find a reason to make use of this stuff. And then again, it reintroduces the importance of understanding where your data storage is, where your data is, how it's managed, how it's offloaded, and, even though we've got online use and data warehouses and data lakes and all this other stuff, those classic processes have to exist. We still have to just good old fashioned, hey, server X just went away.
Right.
I need it back.
Right.
That's, and no matter how many times I look at the cloud options, a lot of the stuff, even when you just store stuff, is like large objects I'll pick on AWS because I know Glacier, unfortunately, too well. Fired up there, super cheap, cheap and deep, slow and low, whatever you want to call it. But it is very slow, because if you want that data back, like if I recorded our video here and I uploaded to Glacier, it would take me about a day to get it back. And it's like a gigabyte.
And that's for a good SLA.
That's right. And that's the thing. It's it's completely asynchronous. There's no guarantees. There's no QoS. It can just die in the middle and it take another day. They'll retry. It's not consistent, so it cannot be used really, in my opinion,
Right.
as a safe target for really true archival storage. If you ever need to go back and get it, if you treat it like a photo album that you're never going to open again, good on you.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, the other thing is just like you want to have the ability, like we were talking about before, to choose, from the vendors that you already trust internally. Same thing is true about the cloud, and cloud is the location of the new lock-in, right? And so one of the things we spend a bunch of time is making sure that when we take these data streams, we actually put them into a container, and the containers are designed to be, self-describing and complete. And so the idea is that a backup stream, a virtual tape, looks like what we would think about a PDF today. And I can take that PDF and I can put that PDF in this cloud or that cloud, or I can move it from this cloud or that cloud. I'm not dependent or reliant on anything from that cloud provider, so that I can avoid that lock-in. I mean, and you bring up Glacier and then Deep Glacier, and the irony is that that's where the tape is today.
Right.
Now none of those guys will say that, but that's where the tape is. And so we have conversations with our customers quite frequently about, it's not whether you're going to use tape or not. It's just where you're going to use that tape and who's going to be in charge of that tape. Are you going to be in charge of that tape, or is your cloud provider going to be in charge of that tape?
Yeah, and as the old thing goes, right? I don't really care as much about my backup solution, but I sure care about my restore solution, because everything seems like it's there until it's not. And this,
Exactly.
it's the trust, and like you said, we've got other providers and other partners we want to engage with, and so what's the best way to do that? And like you said, lock in. There's no better way to lock you in than put your data somewhere.
Yeah. No, that's right. And it's, the company from a long time ago and really focused on throughput, as in throughput so that I can meet the backup window. Okay, got it. No question, that's important. But to your point, how quickly can I restore? And also, how can I ensure that this data is ready to restore when I need it? And so changing the old operational paradigm of, okay, somebody ring up Iron Mountain, get those tapes back in here, and we're going to try a remount. That's our manual way of checking whether this data is still recoverable. And, so now what we do is we use these containers, and we have an executable that looks at, what the data profile was before, what it is now, and if there's been any rot or corruption or problem therein. And so it's not truly a restore, but it's at least a proxy, an automated proxy for restore and restorability of this data.
It is a perfect sort of way of making the change and, sort of easing the process change. And I think that's where it is, like everything we've talked about, we take the technology names out of it, and in the end, it's very much process driven. It's very much trust driven. And this is why also, if you're gonna pick a company to bet on, you want one that's survived through, challenging times, and that's got a really good history, that's got a solid, referenceable customers, large scale customers that you can go to. It was probably interesting for you, coming to FalconStor at, its phase in where it was, and kind of starting a rebirth. And the other thing we talked at the start, I said, the beautiful part about overnight success is it takes about 10 years to become one.
Right.
And it's also very easy to lose track of those overnight successes as they become normalized.
Yeah.
When in fact, you can become a repeated overnight success in between these sort of, troughs of challenge.
Yeah. And we don't sort of advertise, quote unquote, the company as a software defined company, but it is a software company. And the ultimate irony of, the great movement in software defined is, as you know, is that if you start out as software defined and don't ship appliances, you die before you get to the point that you can have any influence. So everyone has to start out that way. And in that respect, FalconStor did. I've been with other software defined companies and actually been on the M&A side of buying other software defined companies that, because they didn't start out with it, meant to their peril or to their
Right.
valuation, they didn't get it, because it's just tough to establish yourself. It's way easier to have a value added software and service capability that can run on the the trusted vendors that have been around, and they're not going anywhere. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hitachi, we do a lot of work with Hitachi. And if you look at Hitachi in the IDC numbers, it's basically, in storage anyway, it's rain or shine. Every quarter, it's 400 million. It doesn't go up. It does not go down. I mean, it's uncanny.
It's like California weather, like LA weather. Just check the temperature. All right. It's exactly the same as it was yesterday.
So their trust is the trust that their customers have in them, and they've gone through their own changes, just like all these vendors have.
That's right.
We get to use a little bit of that history to help make these changes and help these customers make these changes when they want to. We're not forcing them away from tape. They adopt the cloud on their terms. We're not telling them, do this. Everything you were doing before is wrong.
And even as an industry, I find, you and I we're way too close to it. We've got our ear to the ground of so many of these companies, and we watch and we really we look for changes and we look for transitions,
Yeah.
And like I said before, like we attach a history as humans to a name, and we do it ourselves, right? I very often have probably at giving a keynote somewhere said, "Is anyone from Oracle here? I'm going to make an Oracle joke," right? Like we have these things, we joke about the stuff, but the truth is, Oracle, another great example, right? They're doing a great cloud business.
Yeah.
It's certainly not AWS, but while we've been joking about the number of lawyers it takes to run the cloud, they're running a fantastic cloud business.
Yeah.
And so what we'll see is 5 years from now, there won't be any more, tongue-in-cheek jokes about it, except by, weird, pundits like me who still sneak those in every once in a while. But that's it, right? HDS, or Hitachi and Hitachi Vantara, and we've seen this consolidation that they've gone through.
Yeah.
And then, will eventually be just pure software play. And it's really neat to see, like you said, if you're not software on appliance, if your business was the appliance and not the software, you were going to have a bad run.
Yeah. Yeah. You were going to have a bad run now when you've grown up. And the irony is that when you're the young, when you're on the young side, you're going to have a really bad run if you don't have that to keep you going and sustain you. Right. It's such a paradox.
It is really wild. I mean, it keeps Supermicro being the largest hardware manufacturer in the industry, most likely because they are often the white box providers for a lot of those platforms, right?
Yeah, exactly. And look who's growing in storage, Huawei, right?
Right.
So, we just did a 20 petabyte opportunity with Huawei. It was crazy. But, it was just the guys, the last guys that we expected to see at the table, because they're not the traditional big name, but they're becoming a big name.
Yeah. And those are numbers we hear more often. Like we used to joke about petabytes being the future of data, storage sizes. And they're like, "Oh, come on, you and flying cars." You're like, no, this is reality.
That's right. I mean, it really is. We have one service provider that, is really trying to round up the old IBM mainframe market, right? So they're very good with the old AS400 platform and, the IBM I platform now. And they just hit, this is a slightly different profile of customer that they target, but mainframe centric. They now just exceeded 300 customers and 70 petabytes. And the 70 petabytes, about half of those customers have a small on-site appliance, and that replicates to, in this case, their cloud, not IBM or not AWS or Azure, but they've created their own cloud. So you're going to see, I think, a lot more of the service providers looking at backup and recovery as a service and saying, that's a really good business for me. And it offloads that responsibility from these overstretched IT teams that are saying, I got my hands full with converting from, physical to virtual to containers.
That's right.
The business that you're in and your other job, right?
Well, they learned that you don't want to spend your money and your engineering time on certain things. And we've now accepted that DR as a service, backup as a service to a consolidated cloud platform. We know we're okay, I'm paying more because I'm seeing the real bill come in. We actually had the bill the whole time. You cut up Iron Mountain and your courier charges and your physical all this other stuff.
Yeah.
It was hidden behind a lot of other invoices, running your own data center with your air cool and everything.
Right.
When you hide it, when I went to I was looking at relocating a data center to a co-location facility, and I worked for a large financial company. Mm-hmm. And we looked at it and said, okay, well, colo, according to the size we're choosing, will be, in and around $85,000 a month.
Yeah.
And of course, the CIO was like, you've got to be crazy. We're going to pay $85,000 a month for somebody to host our data center.
Right.
It's right over you physically point to the room and you're like, but that's not free. Let's back up the cost against it. And we realized once we worked it out, it was cheaper to run than to move the bloody stuff over to the cloud, right? And then from there, 24/7 operations, 365-day protection, 5 nines, all the stuff that I didn't have. And it was actually, in the end, would have been cheaper to run. And so the choice was made. But if you didn't look to the reality of the real cost and the intangible cost of the operational impact, it's hard. I think we're getting there. More people get that you got to just look at the decision as a numbers decision, and the numbers line up now.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's when we start looking at, this space and the space that FalconStor is in backup and recovery, it's the first thing is that we talk about is, okay, so how do I take costs out and where does that cost come from? And often but all my backup vendors already have dedupe, right?
Right.
And they do. Isn't dedupe all the same? But it's when you can put this all into a global pool and start looking across all these different streams, you start seeing the magic happen. And that's just for that initial copy. It might be on a SAN, and then now I'm making the SAN a lot smaller, so I'm shrinking the footprint and the cost profile and the management overhead of the person having to deal with that. And then you look at the second copy and say, okay, now I've got to put that on tape. Okay, I've got to rehydrate to go to tape. I mean, there's no magic around.
That's right. You can't get out of that one.
Get out of that one. But if I can move it to a second site or move it to the cloud and it's dehydrated, then I'm starting to see some savings pile up. And then you're right, the economic argument becomes a lot easier to put down on a very simple piece of paper, not something that takes 5 sheets.
That's right.
In the envelope that says, here's the math. It's not too complicated to see. It works out.
Yeah, the industry's ready. I mean, the businesses are ready. And last year definitely, urged us to rethink a lot of these decisions that we were kind of afraid to visit and revisit. I think I talked to customer after customer through my company, and they're like, look, we would never have done this, but we're closing this data center up because we've got literally, I had one company and they had 2 skids full of servers.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, we can't get in to build it. And we can't take the risk. So what do we do? And they're like, okay, well, time to look at the cloud. And suddenly what was not an option became an option. And as a result, it made them change the way they do things. And
Right.
they've achieved incredible benefits by changing their operational model
Right.
and then matching the technology to what was the business requirement. And it, like, the funny thing is when you go back to the classic, like, positioning and in messaging and value drivers and positive business outcomes, you're like, oh yeah, that's actually how it works. They actually got a new operating model that saves them money and people, and it meant that they can have people around the world access their stuff, and they suddenly, shaved off their long-term expenses by getting rid of a lease and doing other things. It was very interesting to watch it, that you would have never made the decision until it was a forced decision. And
Yeah.
then they're so thankful that they were put in the position, not why they were put there, of course, but they were thankful that they were able to do it. And the benefit, no employees lost.
Right.
Huge impact for them, right?
Right. It's not a, it's not a, you know, there's not going to be a real loser in this outcome. It's going to be, you've got to just deploy these people over here. I mean, you and I and many people here will see, listen to folks in the industry that are thinking about digital transformation. Then that's a gargantuan term that I don't always know what it means, but
Yeah,
we know that it's a very high priority, and that means there's going to be more applications and more requirements and more and more and more coming. We got to get people over there
right.
into that, and that means we got to free up capital in the places that are not driving those primary applications, because they're under siege. Their businesses are under siege.
So we've been around the industry a while, Chris.
I know.
I'm curious, what's the thing that you've seen the most consistent, even though the tech has changed over your time in the industry?
Well, it sounds simple, but I was able to, for a time, and I'm a strategy consultant by background, and I did a bunch of work with Jeffrey Moore, the Crossing the Chasm innovator over at Stanford, and I think it comes back to that, which is fundamentally it's solution to a problem and thinking about the whole solution, what he would call the whole product, and all the pieces and components that are needed to solve that problem. And we read about it every day when you think about working backwards and what the folks at AWS are just ensconced in,
Yeah.
and I think that is more true than ever. And so I've definitely seen companies, including the one that I'm working with now, come out and be a little bit too focused on the new widget and maybe losing a little bit of sight of what's the problem that I'm solving, and really going deep, not just saying the problem is backup and archive. That tells you nothing.
Right.
Let's get down 3 more levels. What specifically is the problem, and how do we solve that, and what are all the pieces that are required? So maybe that's a trite one, but as IT gets more and more complicated, you got to go back to those kinds of basics, I think.
It's very true. I mean, The Goal by Eli Goldratt was not written in 2009 when Gene Kim was taking it and making DevOps and the Phoenix project and bringing the stuff through Tripwire and making it a reality. Goldratt wrote about this stuff decades ago.
Yeah.
Those things are, all we're doing is we're seeing them proven over time, but the fundamentals have been there. It's funny when you actually go deeper. I mean, I have a book on my bookshelf. It's downstairs. I should have it up here. Is The Business Value of Computers. It's the one that Steve Jobs says, this is what made me start a company and build a computer, because I saw the power it could have and the real financial impact it could make. But it allowed me to build, he said, it allowed him to build a business to do something fantastic, make a dent in the world, et cetera, right? But those, again, the age of that book, I forget what the publishing date was, but it's again, decades old now, far older than any of the technology, we've touched.
Yeah.
And yet they still hold very true.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And Crossing the Chasm is probably maybe not that old, but it's old as well. And the irony is that when Jeff and Michael and the team update the book, they actually don't update the paradigm or the methodology. They
Right.
update the examples
That's
because,
it.
because no disrespect, no one wants to hear about the early days of the Oracle database anymore. What they want to hear about is what happened at Nest and what happened at Waze
Right.
and what happened at Robinhood, right? Or the newest example of it, but the methodology remains the same.
Yeah, it's so funny. They just reissued the Pragmatic Programmer as well. They did like the 20th or 25th year reedition. They said, and they went back to the well with a lot of stuff. They realized most of the fundamentals were the same, but like you said, they had to update the languages and but like the fundamentals were so like that core is still true. They just wanted to make sure that the references were relevant to a new reader, so that it wasn't like, yeah, talking about old school stuff. Even like Built to Last, I often hear the tough thing about Built to Last is that, well, most of the companies didn't last.
Yeah.
If you looked at them long enough, they were built to last at the time it was written, but they almost all exited the business that they were vastly successful in because of a real divergence in the business plan.
Yeah, that's
But
right. That's exactly right. And it's your ability to shift with those changes that makes you relevant, right? And it indicate that you're built to last. Some of them weren't.
yeah, and I think so. It's funny, and I'll go because in the background of your video, I see a beautiful cutaway acoustic there, and it's always nice when you get someone who plays an acoustic and gets above the 14th fret for a change.
Uh-huh.
I like the reach there. Um, you know what's amazing about technologists and everything when we take it outside of storage and backup and servers and whatever, like we see that the same things come true in guitars, and you see like bicycles you're very familiar with. And actually, if you don't mind, I'd love to talk about your cycling history and your goals here, because I was excited by this. Look at that, tour winners, there you go. a few uh, there's a few years blanked out there are sadly for Mr. Armstrong. I don't know if that's the
That's right. I don't see a U.S. Postal Service jersey on here. That's the good news.
that's I'm still torn on that one, but but you are I'd like to hear about Life Moves.
Mm. Oh, Life Moves. Well, Life Moves is very interesting. So, this is basically it's a local homeless program that I work with, and we know homelessness is a real problem in many different areas of the U.S., but any attempt to try and solve this at a macro level just always seems to fail. So I said, instead of just writing a check and saying that'll help, I got involved. And so I'm involved with a local homeless program here in the Bay Area, where really the good news about it is it's for people who are drug free and are trying to get their lives back together. And when I interact with them, I inevitably find that something came along, and whether it was their own drug use, whether it was a health problem of a family member, it just took their entire life sideways. And it took their life sideways for longer than they thought. And when they tried to catch back onto the spinning wheel, it was really hard. So, and you'll like on the bike side, what I do for them is a couple things. One is I work with them on just basic things like cleaning up their resumes. Sometimes this is a cleanup that's 20 years in the making.
Yeah.
Trying them, find that opportunity to get back engaged. And everybody that's homeless, one of the things that's a basic need for them is transportation. So I try and get every single one of them a bike. So I always am taking in bikes and fixing them up and either providing them to the people that are in the program or sometimes when they're a little bit too nice, because I do live in Palo Alto, which is a bike theft capital of the world.
Oh my.
When they're too nice, we take those and sell them. And these donations that come in, I fix them up and we sell them. And we put the proceeds to work behind these folks. So really good program that seeing some good success. And it's, the only way to solve it is local.
That's it. And the only thing that's as fantastic as a bicycle for the mind is truly a bicycle for a human, and giving them mobility, giving them access. And I was excited when I read about that, and I thought this is really, really neat. I'd love to actually spend more time to talk about much more,
Yeah.
Chris, but I know we're coming up to our time. And thank you very much. Number one, for that's a fantastic program, and I love that no one is above giving back. And in fact, one of the best things we can do is, the further we get into having success and being able to give back, is to do more of it. And it's
Yeah.
nice to see somebody, seeing the value and the impact you can have.
Well, and just, for those people out there that are doing something similar, because I'm not alone doing this, but I get more out of it than they do.
Right.
It reminds me how fortunate we are to be in this industry that's created so much opportunity. And it's a great thing to be part of. Great thing for my kids to be part of with me.
That's it. That's also a great thing. It's not just an action, but it's a legacy. It's something we can teach our kids and others in the industry and our peer group. So,
Yeah.
so Chris, thank you very much. This has been fantastic. I love what you and the folks are doing. I'd love to get reconnected again in future. We'll dig more into bikes and guitars a bit, because that's really where the fun is. But I'm glad we could go deep on some of the tech and ecosystem stuff, because it's not often I get a chance to dig in on people that are doing this successfully, and hearing the real honest feedback about where these challenges are, and where folks can help. So if someone wants to reach out and get connected to you, Chris, what's the best way to do so?
Just hit me on LinkedIn.
All right. Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you, Chris Cummings, from FalconStor, and you're an advisor as well. Again, so much I wanted to explore, but it's such a good run. Didn't want to slow any of this conversation down. I really appreciate you taking the time with me today.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Really appreciate it too. Great to be here.